Hello?
Hello, Luís.
Olá, tudo bem?
Bom dia.
És bom?
Hello.
Andrea?
How are you, Luís?
Fine. And you?
Fine.
We cannot see you. Turn on
Okay.
your video, please.
Yeah.
Hello. And
It was a pity, que pena.
Thank you.
Nós estamos juntos,
Sim, sim.
pero nós estamos virtualmente.
Mhm. Did you see my message? Mark Meirowitz is not coming.
Yes, there was something for, but okay. Only he will not be able to take part.
Yeah.
All other participants are confirmed. Bruno, Reis, and Marlene.
Yeah.
Well,
yeah. At least, as
Marlene
far as
is
I know.
already here. Mm-hmm.
Bruno.
Yes, I'm here. Hello.
Hello.
Marlene?
Yes, I'm here.
Oh, thank you and welcome.
Thank you.
Hello.
Are you in Paris or in
Yes,
the US,
I am.
Marlene? In Paris.
Yeah.
How is the situation there? Because
Not
we have
good. Really not good. Yeah.
It's bad everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it was bad in the US when I left, so that doesn't make any big difference.
No.
It's bad everywhere.
So finally, maybe in Lisbon, in Rome, so situation is not so hard.
Good.
Maybe.
Yeah, it's not good, but it's not so bad
Yeah.
as in Spain,
As in
in
Spain.
Madrid in particular, or of course in the US, or even in Paris, I believe.
We've been having a spike in terms of the number of cases, but I don't know exactly why, but the mortality rate in Portugal is apparently lower.
Yeah.
We have very few.
More young people infected.
Excuse
So
me?
there are more young people infected,
Mm-hmm.
but less death, fortunately.
For now, we don't know how this will be in the next weeks and months.
So do you want to keep the sequence of our communications as the program, or you would like to change it, Marlene?
Okay.
Andrea?
Of course.
Bruno is not here with us yet.
Yes, but I think he just messaged me. Is
Connecting.
is about to connect. Yeah.
Okay.
So we have to wait next year to be together in the next conference about the Eurasian studies.
Yeah, we will organize another one next year.
Yes,
Hopefully,
please.
hopefully, in face-to-face, human contact.
Always it's a good time to pass it.
We are waiting your visit.
Yeah, thank you.
Always welcome.
Hello, everyone.
Hi, Bruno.
Hello. Hello.
Welcome.
Thank you.
So maybe we should wait a few more minutes before.
Yeah, 1 or 2
Beginning.
minutes more. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Andrea, Marlene,
Yes.
Bruno, do you have any PowerPoint presentation or a file to share?
No.
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 Sorry, but I have one. Let me try to share it. Do you see it?
Yes.
Now, yes.
Now we see. Yes.
Okay.
So we are supposed to speak for around 15 minutes.
Yes,
Yeah.
I will explain the the rules in my very brief introduction. But yes, that's what is you're supposed to, you know, to have a first round of 15 minutes for each speaker. So then we will have time for Q&A.
Okay.
Shall we start, Luís?
Yeah, I think
Okay,
it's better.
5 minutes.
Not to delay the session.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. My name is Luís Rodrigues. I'm the director of the Center for International Studies at ISCTE, Lisbon. And we are very honored and proud to be one of the partner institutions of the Eurasian Politics and Society Conference. And I'm very glad to be here today moderating this panel on the impacts of COVID-19 on Greater Eurasia. I would like to welcome our 4 very distinguished speakers and also to welcome all the audience. Today we have in this panel Professors Andrea Carteny from Sapienza University in Rome, Professor Bruno Cardoso Reis from ISCTE, Lisbon, Professor Luís Tomé from Autónoma University in Lisbon, and Professor Marlene Laruelle from George Washington University. Again, I want to thank all panelists for being here today and for participating at this year's edition of IEPAS. Unfortunately, Professor Mark Meirowitz, who was supposed to be in this panel from State University, New York, due to personal reasons, he would not be able to attend. We will start this panel with a first round of initial interventions from all speakers. I will ask all the members of our panel to make this first intervention for around 15 minutes in this first round of remarks, and then I'm sure that later on we will have opportunity for you to have a few more thoughts and perhaps even to reply to each other remarks. And finally, we will open up the debate for the audience. We are supposed to finish the panel by 1 p.m. and I was asked to be very rigorous in that time limit. So that's when we will have to finish. Meanwhile, the audience can start to put questions in the chat room, or simply to write down your name and your institutional affiliation and express your desire to intervene in the chat, and then we will give you the word in the Q&A period. I also would like to tell everyone that this session is being recorded and will be available at the websites of the organizing institutions. So please, those who do not want their sound and their image to be recorded, please turn off image and sound. In fact, I ask all the audience to remain with the sound off while our panelists are speaking, so we can have a session with a better sound quality, okay? So that being said, we will follow the order of the program, and without losing much more time, I will give the word immediately to Professor Andrea Carteny. Thank you very much for being here, and the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you. Thank you a lot for your introduction, Luis, and thank you to Luis Tomé, to all our friends from Lisbon for the organization of this meeting. So that could have been very nice to be together there, take a coffee and a wine, but we are talking about the COVID and the effects on the Greater Eurasia. So we are inside this kind of lack of physical feelings. That is a pity, but we can talk about that because we are in the middle of. So in somehow we are talking about geopolitics and international relations in the same time in which we live it. Because in the sense of the Greater Eurasia, for sure, I can share with you some suggestion, some comments, because that is one of the most important areas affected by the pandemic. Maybe we can focus on Belarus in that sense. I was taking some notes and publishing an article in Le Formiche, in Italian newsroom, mostly about comments on international politics. And the question was quite very interested. So it was the middle of the interest of Italian debate, normally very distracted on these issues. A couple of days ago, I was in the parliament, also a meeting with the expert on the topic how support democratic movement and liberal movement in case like Belarus, where in a time in which all the contact and the links are more difficult because of the COVID. And so in that sense, so we can set up also some kind of criteria of this area, because for sure problems of pandemics are different between the European Union, US, or Russia and the Greater and Eurasia, and the Greater Eurasia in links with the Chinese world, for example. One of the most important element of Eurasia, so obviously I share this comment because with you as well-known stuff, dynastic element and leadership element are very important in Russia, in China, in the setting up of Eurasia. So traditionally by the Tsarist Empire, and after the Soviet Union, the empire, so-called identity, territorial identity in this third continent, as we can say, that was very well linked to a leadership able during centuries and so on, also to take to give the body of a sense of feeling and identity. And in that sense, in time of crisis, that is quite very well required by population. So a strong leadership is as seen always as one of the most important factor of stability in time of like a warfare, wartime, or in period of lack of security. And for sure, COVID also in the Greater Eurasia played this game. In Belarus, question is that affected by the COVID, there was there is this great movement as a democratic or critic movement against the old leader Lukashenko. But for sure, in this case, also isolation in terms of international relations are playing in favor of the old leader. And Russia. So Navalny is waked up. So we will see what he's going to say. But for sure, dynamics of democratic debate, as so-called democratic, so in the space in which we can mention that for Russian environments is on the table. But also in this case, the leadership of Putin is a reference in general for public opinion, Russian opinion, and is playing like the godfather also for Belarus crisis in front of European Union. And so further factor, the main one, is China. So Chinese were at the origin of all this crisis, but with the leadership of Xi Jinping, they were able to play also the player of, so the role of who is the first winner and the first fighter against the COVID. And so in that sense, regimes are trying to stabilize their own power, and the last condemned to several years of prison, also of personalities very close to the regime in China. So talking about very popular people, like yesterday there was 18 years of condemned to the prison for this very, very famous man, entrepreneur, businessman, close and enrolled in the ranks of Chinese People's Party, Communist Party, because of financial reasons, because of corruption reasons. So also in that case, we can see how in this area, leaders and movements are very under a factor of stress of the COVID. Maybe COVID is an accelerator of many of some trends on this area, but also can be the factor of weakness in some case. I want to expand and give you a last comment on Taiwan, because there was also in Italy quite a debate about Taiwan, because quite nobody knows where is it. But there is a very popular leader, political leader, Beppe Grillo. So it's a starting point of Five Stars Movement. It's a comic, it's a comedian. It's like politics in Italy is quite very comedy stuff. He was starting this movement and now expressing government, the main force of the government in Italy. And they are quite pro-Chinese in general. And he said that also quite kidding or in serious way, but he said that Taiwan and Singapore are dictatorships in the Chinese world. So like quite, so one having a kind of role to stabilize, to be a reference for Beijing, also for legal entities inside there or not. So after beyond the confusion about the status of Singapore or Taiwan or linked with Tibet and Xinjiang and so on, so there was a note of the Taiwan representative in Italy saying that we are a democracy, we have a liberal system and political party system and a representative institution. So in that case, also the COVID played a role, and this role is to strengthen the leadership and the government of Taiwan in this area, because virtuously acting against the virus, and also in all this area, so the COVID stressed up the links between countries, but also in the sense to strengthen, for example, the links with Japan and Taiwan and US in a context in which Beijing is playing the role of stabilization, also including Taiwan. So I want to mention that, because maybe that is, so we need the thermometer, so we need real criteria, reference to have the measure of the trends, and maybe Belarus and Taiwan can be the focal point of the the next steps of the virus and the new international relations framework in our close future. So I stop.
Thank you very much, Professor Andrea, for your intervention and for keeping it within the time limit. So now I will give the word to Professor Bruno Reis from ISCTE.
Okay, let me just try this. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. It's also a pleasure to be associated with this event, in which the Center for International Studies, where I work, where also Luís Nuno works, is also a full partner with our friends at Autónoma and of course in other places in Eurasia. But to go straight to the point, in terms of the impact of COVID in global politics, and more specifically in terms of Eurasia, I would say that first of all, we have to recognize that there is still a lot we don't know. So this is kind of my get out of jail card. The pandemic is still ongoing. We have discovered at a very heavy cost that viruses are very sneaky, very dynamic things. We have watched the pandemic first have a huge impact in China, where it originated. At least most people in the world think it originated in China, and some people, including the US president, very much insist on that point. Even that, as we know, is open to contention and to kind of geopolitical games. But in any event, let's say it started in China. Certainly it was the country that was most heavily impacted at the beginning of the year, at the end of last year, the beginning of this year. Then it very quickly spread. It affected very heavily Europe, especially Italy and Spain. In March, at the peak of the pandemic so far, most of the people dying were dying in Europe. And then, of course, it spread also to the Americas, hitting very hard the United States, where it's still creating a lot of problems and death. Brazil then was the leading country in terms of numbers of deaths. And now it's India, so it's very much a dynamic thing with an asymmetric impact also at different points in time. Also in terms of different economic sectors, it has hugely affected certain sectors. Of course, tourism or aviation are an obvious example. It has actually led to a significant increase in other sectors like the whole digital economy, digital sales. So it's still an ongoing thing. It's a very much a live thing, even if viruses apparently are not really alive. And we cannot really evaluate fully the impact of the pandemic and this differential impact of the pandemic until the pandemic is over, or at least very much under control, until we have some kind of working vaccine, working cure. The second preliminary note I would want to make is that there is a room for debate in terms of how impactful this pandemic will be in terms of international politics. Also because of this, because we don't know exactly when it will end, how it will end, what will be the kind of the end cost. And therefore, I think certainly at this point in time, we can still debate whether it will have a deep transformative impact, or if in a way we are just shell-shocked. We are still very much under the impact in our personal lives of the pandemic, and we are maybe exaggerating the long-term impact of COVID-19 in global politics. If probably most of you saw this recent dossier in the Foreign Affairs magazine, where basically you had some authors arguing, yes, it will fundamentally transform global politics. What is interesting is that the more kind of moderate wing was basically still arguing, yes, it will be a significant turning point. It will transform things, but mostly by, in a way, deepening trends that are already in place. So I think that's significant. There seems to be a degree of consensus that the impact will be a major impact. Some argue it will fundamentally transform things. Others think it will be less of a breaking point and will, in a way, deepen ongoing trends. And I think we can also maybe discuss that in the Q&A. But I honestly, I don't think we can really answer for the time being. One possible point I would like to emphasize is that one possible victim of COVID-19 in this kind of reading where we think that the impact will be more transformative is the very idea of Eurasia, which is of interest to this conference. At least Eurasia, of course, not in the geographical sense, but in the more political sense in recent years, where there was this idea that maybe Eurasia would turn into a real thing, meaning primarily a much stronger connection between China and Europe, a much stronger link between China and Europe, especially in economics, but with impact in other areas, and all the countries in between, in a way. I think that there is room to argue that maybe this is one of the big question marks, if not definitely a victim of the pandemic, a big question mark. And this takes me to my first of 4 major trends that I would like, 3 or 4 major trends that I would like to emphasize briefly also, of course, to provide then food for thought and for debate. The first has to do with let's say the hard geostrategic impact of the pandemic. One thing I think we can say so far is that the pandemic has definitely heightened the tensions between the two major powers in the global system today, in terms of economic power, in terms of military power, China and United States. So I think this is undeniable. The US president keeps, just yesterday at the UN or the day before at the UN General Assembly, keeps insisting this is the China virus, it's the Kung flu. So it basically keeps blaming China for the pandemic. We tend to forget, but there seemed to be this kind of draft of agreement in terms of the trade war between the United States and China just in February, when the pandemic really started spreading and then eating very hard the United States. And arguably the US administration, the US president decided he needed some kind of scapegoat. And I'm not saying that China is not to blame at all in this whole thing, but certainly there's international politics and internal politics at play here. But the main thing is it definitely heightened very significantly the tensions between the United States and China. I was at the the Munich Security Conference in February, and one of the big takeaways, I think, for everyone there was the show of unity between the U.S. administration, so the members of the U.S. government that were there, the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of State, and the leaders of Democratic leaders who were there, like Nancy Pelosi, who was asked directly, are you in agreement with the Trump administration regarding China? And she said, this is one area where I have no hesitation in saying we are completely in agreement with the administration. I cannot understand how our partners in Europe do not realize that they cannot keep cooperating in key technologies, for instance, in key economic sectors, with basically an economy that is controlled by the Chinese Communist Party, by this totalitarian party. So this is one of the big takeaways, I think. We will have to see what happens. We will have to see what happens also in November in terms of the US elections. But this seems to be a deepening trend, one that was deepened by the COVID, by the impact of COVID, and this of course creates huge difficulties for the global system, for multilateral institutions. We see, for instance, the problems with the World Health Organization as a victim of this war, the US accusing it of being controlled by China. It's a huge problem for the countries, for most states, if not all states, across the world, in terms of security, in terms of economics, in terms of technology. And I think it's obvious it will have a huge impact in terms of Eurasia. With Europe, that's very obvious, but in many other places, in Asia, in Europe, in Latin America, in Africa, you will see this increasing pressure to, in a way, choose between the two sides. I don't know if this will lead to, this was one second trend I wanted to mention, this kind of crisis of globalization. I think it's obvious that there is a degree of crisis of globalization. Again, I think COVID clearly is a factor here. We saw, for instance, in Europe, which was traditionally a champion of open trade, where European economies are, of course, very much exporting economies. That's the case of Germany. That's also the case of Portugal. Very favorable to open trade, to free trade. Suddenly, there's this whole question, well, what happens when you have a pandemic and then 60% or 70% of the equipment that you need, the medical equipment that you need, comes from China, and maybe China is not available because it doesn't want to sell, or even because it cannot produce these materials because it's suffering some kind of disaster. So I think there's a clear change in terms of the debate in Europe. It's very visible in the European Union, this idea that you need resilience, that you need strategic reserves, that you need to make sure that you have key industries, key economic sectors to a much larger degree based in Europe, secured in Europe. To be clear, at the personal level, I think this actually can be a problem. I think it's a real problem, this question of resilience and strategic reserves. I'm a security scholar. I've been arguing that for a very long time in Portugal. So in a way, I'm sadly glad that the pandemic brought the attention of many more people to this problem. But I think it's also a problem to in a way, be too reliant on your own supplies. So you need a diversified system. But in any event, I think this is it's the most serious crisis of globalization for many decades. I think this is obvious. The pandemic, the tension between the US and China, all of that is adding to a very significant crisis of this model of the economy, which was very much globalized. This just-in-time kind of model of supply chain. So I think this is a major factor. Again, at least in the short term, it will create a significant disruption, significant costs of adaptation across Eurasia, and I think that's also a major challenge. A third major trend that I think is linked with this is the economic cost. So again, we don't know exactly what the economic cost will be. We don't know. We know that it will probably be very much asymmetric. In Europe, maybe 7, 8, 10% fall in GDP. In China, apparently only -1%, but of course, China was also growing much faster. You have all these different numbers. We'll have, and they are still, of course, very much evolving. We still don't know when we will have a cure, a working vaccine. We still don't know what is the right working model in the meantime to reconcile health with the health of people, with the health of the economy, with some kind of working economy. So we don't know exactly what the cost will be, but it's very clear that it will be a huge cost. We just don't know if it will be a Great Depression in the short term or a Great Depression also in the long term. Again, there are encouraging signs, for instance, in Europe, in the US, in China, of major efforts to rebuild the economy, as you know, in Europe, this major effort to finance the recovery, including with for the first time and breaking a crucial taboo, this mutualized European debt. So this is very, very important. But again, the story is not over, so we don't know when the working cure, some kind of treatment will arrive and allow for a much more normal economy. So this is still a huge uncertainty, how deep the economic crisis will be. We do know, what we do know, with a major impact in terms of geopolitics, is that these economic stresses always increase conflict. They increase conflict between countries, they increase conflict within countries. It's not always violent conflict, happily, but it's sometimes also violent conflict. So I think we can expect the pandemic to, in a way, maybe not in the short term. In the short term, the impact can actually be to freeze conflicts because people are just too, even the warring parties are too concerned with surviving and all of that. But I think in the medium term, it will increase the stresses. It will increase the trend towards more conflicts, including internal conflicts, but also conflicts within between countries, as we saw in the case of, as we see in the case of China and the US. But that's not the only. That's not the only possible example of that. So I think we should also expect that. Of course, one major trend also linked with all of this is this war for vaccines. And this is maybe where I will end. I don't know if I have much more time, but so the war for vaccines is very much ongoing. We saw different strategies here. We have, incredibly, it's an amazing thing. There was a degree of cooperation despite all this. China did eventually divulge the genome for the virus very quickly. We had tests much more quickly than ever in history. We have final stage tests for vaccines much earlier than at any time in history, and dozens of vaccines. So in a way, this medical arms race is a good thing. You know, humans are very competitive, and this is a driver for innovation. So yes, we have lots and lots of vaccines. I think this is not a problem at this stage. Where I think it becomes very problematic, this war for vaccines, is at the later stage. Because the crucial challenge will be, well, of course, getting working vaccines, safe vaccines, effective vaccines, but also getting them in sufficient amounts, producing them in huge amounts. And this was really never done. And it's I'm told by people who are experts in this, in the medical industry, usually you have maybe hundreds of millions of vaccines produced. Now you'll have to produce billions of vaccines. For this to be really effective. And this is the crucial challenge. And this is where I think this becomes worrying. We saw, for instance, Russia playing this kind of very smart information war kind of game, which they play. So they were the first to announce that they had a working vaccine, even if they themselves say we have not done these final, very large final trials. We are not able to produce more than 1 million vaccines, so much less than the population of Russia. But they were playing that kind of game. China and the US are very much relying on their own capability to produce with a number of companies to try to come up with the first working vaccine. European Union is playing a different game, is in a way filling in for the traditional role of the US as the kind of the leader of multilateral institutions. So it's very much associated with the World Health Organization, worked with the existing coalition for infectious diseases, which brings together countries, multilateral organizations. That the vaccine will be widely produced and widely distributed across the world, which of course makes sense in terms of a more effective fight against the virus. But I think it would be naive not to realize that the way this race goes will affect also, will have a geopolitical impact. So who will be the first country to come up with a credible working vaccine? Who will they provide the vaccine to? This will be a major kind of hard power kind of tool in global politics in the near future. And this is of course something that we also would need to follow up on. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Bruno, for your intervention. A lot of food for thought in these two first interventions. And now I'll give the word to Professor Luís Tomé. The floor is yours. I think you're...
Thank you, Luís. Let me try to share my PowerPoint. Yeah.
But we lost your video in the meantime.
Yeah. Can you confirm that you're seeing?
We are seeing the PowerPoint, but we are not seeing you.
Okay. So thank you, Luís. It is an honor to participate in a panel discussion shared by you and with such distinguished speakers. Sorry if I'm going to repeat some of the words that both Bruno and Andrea already said. I fully agree with them. So sorry if I'm going to repeat something. But major crises have major consequences, usually unforeseen. And in addition to the pandemic crisis, we have to add these devastating economic, social, and political impacts, whose effects, as already Bruno said, also are even more difficult to foresee. It is too early to draw definite conclusions about the impacts of this crisis, but it seems clear, to me at least, that pandemic crisis has underlined and accelerated backward trends and has triggered dynamics that could redefine world geopolitics and the international order. Due to time constraints, I highlight here only a few, 6 to be precise, of these trends and dynamics. It is already clear why some countries have done better than others in dealing with the crisis so far. And there is every reason to think those trends will continue. The factors responsible for successful pandemic responses have been state capacity, social trust, and leadership. Thus, it is not a matter of regime type, true for autocracies. However, nationalism, populism, and attacks on the liberal world order have been suspending free movement, and stopping transport links without coordination. Coming after the sovereign debt crisis, the migrant crisis, and Brexit, the coronavirus crisis is further damaging the EU's cohesion. The necessary articulation between member states seems to have resurfaced with the economic recovery plan and financial package, but the lack of coordination in managing the pandemic crisis persists in the second wave, and the Union still has to face a context with a less reliable US and a more assertive China. In what concerns the US, its highly polarized society and incompetent President Trump blocked the state from functioning effectively, having judged that his political fortunes were best served by confrontation rather than national unity. President Trump has used the crisis to pick fights and increase social cleavages. The US terrific performance facing the pandemic has several causes, for sure, but the most significant has been a president who has failed to lead. The same happened in the US foreign policy. The lack of will and/or ability of Trump's administration to lead the world in facing a global crisis, as also to articulate with its allies and partners, persisting in the protectionist rhetoric and attacking international institutions, in particular the World Health Organization, rather than galvanizing them. This posture may be due to a certain hegemonic fatigue. See, Luís? Are you listening to me?
Yes, yes. I think it was my connection that was poor.
Thank you. Maybe this posture is due to a certain hegemonic fatigue or to a cyclical American isolationism or strategic retreat, but the Trump's brand is unquestionable. The failure to manage the pandemic is compounded by the US biggest fall in GDP and employment in many decades. Taken together, these factors result in a new questioning of the US position and role in the international system. On the other hand, the demonization of China has been instrumented by Trump to deflect criticism. At the same time, however, in the context of the pandemic crisis, the perception of China as a major rival and threat has become relatively consensual in the US. The global distribution of power will continue to shift eastward, since East Asia has done better at managing the situation than Europe or the US. The negative economic fallout from the pandemic at the developed economies of Europe and the US may be more profound and long-lasting than in Asia-Pacific economies. The pandemic is therefore likely to accelerate the delocation of global economic power from west to east. But we will probably see a retreat from hyper-globalization, or at least we'll see the end of globalization as we know it. At the same time, China will probably emerge from the pandemic and economic double crisis with the major GDP in real terms, with the consequences this will have on all other power dimensions, and also reducing the scope for decoupling strategies vis-à-vis China. At the end of the day, this means a move away from a US-centric globalization to a more China-centric globalization. Even though the pandemic originated in China and Beijing initially covered and allowed it to spread, China is likely to emerge from the crisis with a widespread perception of being a new superpower. China is seeking to capitalize on the failure of the US and Europe, trying to raise its global profile and demonstrate its importance as an indispensable global player. The crisis is also likely to favor Chinese influence in international organizations such as the UN and the WTO, as well as China's spheres of influence in parts of Africa, Europe, Latin America, Middle East, Central Asia, and South and Southeast Asia. At the same time, however, many countries and companies are likely to review their dependence on China for vital products and to take steps to diversify their supply lines. On the other hand, in the context of pandemic, China has shown greater assertiveness, seeming to abandon the traditional line of peaceful coexistence and essentially non-confrontational posture. From the intensification of militarization in South China Sea to the national security law imposed on Hong Kong, military confrontation with India for the first time in decades, and successive diplomatic frictions and threats of sanctions to various countries. This represents a great leap forward in realization of the Chinese dream and the affirmation of China's claims. However, Beijing may be going too far and too fast, risking provoking a real anti-China front. In times of crisis, global rivalries tend to intensify rather than abate, and the pandemic crisis seems to confirm this sentence. COVID-19 is not a cause of competition between the US and China, but has exacerbated tensions and frictions that have existed for years, from trade disputes to the Taiwan question, human rights, South China Sea, technology, and so on, in the context aggravated by both Chinese assertiveness and the US presidential election campaign. As such, in a multipolar world power structure, this crisis has reinforced the perception of bipolarity among the apparently declining and emerging superpowers. Therefore, to conclude, I would say that another impact resulting from the pandemic crisis is to accentuate the tendency for the Greater Eurasia, that is the whole of the European and Asian continents, to become a target and a stage for geopolitical, geostrategic, and geoeconomic moves from China and US, whether in competition and confrontation or in cooperation and engagement. Thank you. I look forward to your questions and comments, Luís.
Thank you very much, Luís, for your intervention and for your presentation. And without further delay, I'll give the word to Professor Marlene.
Thank you so
Marlene
much.
Laruelle, thank you.
Thank you. I was asked to discuss the impact of the pandemic specifically on Central Asia. So my presentation will be moving from the big Eurasia to the small Central Eurasia or Central Asian region. But I agree with several trends that have been discussed by the previous presenter. And I think what the pandemic is showing is that, in fact, it's reinforcing all the existing trends that we have noticed in the region, and it's make them more radical and more visible. And I will mention 6 key points for the Central Asia regions. The first point that we notice is that the differences between countries on the way they have been responding to the crisis has been increased. I mean, all this region has a culture of non-transparency and a tradition of considering that every number is a secret, a state secret. And so what we have seen emerging is really a division of the region in 2 groups. On one side, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and Kyrgyzstan, who have been able to make some demonstration of a kind of transparency in managing the crisis, not perfect, of course, transparency, a lot of issues, I will come back on that, but still they acknowledge the crisis quite rapidly, and they try to kind of regularly inform their public opinion. And then on another side, Turkmenistan and Tajikistan, who kept the denial of the pandemics for very long, Turkmenistan still continuing to do so, and who really try to negate the existence of the pandemics on their own territory. We have some surveys showing that, in fact, the public opinion in Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, I mean, the public opinion in Kazakhstan is trusting largely the government, while the public opinion in Kyrgyzstan is not trusting its own government, which is the most kind of democratic in the region. So that's interesting, because that shows that the trust that existed before the crisis has been reinforced. So public opinion who were trusting their government trust it more. Public opinion who were distrusting their government distrust more, right? But the crisis didn't reverse the feeling of trust. Second key point is that it's interesting to see, as in Central Asia, the health structure has been unable to cope, of course, with the size of the pandemic, but in fact, exactly the same way as we had in Europe or in the US, right? So they have less financial capacity, they are less good equipment, but they are facing the same difficulties as more developed countries. So we have noticed, for example, that of course lack of medication and equipment, big differences if you live in a city or if you live in a rural region where the health structure are usually in very bad shape. Almost a lack of emergency structure, right? If you have to call for an ambulance, even in one of the Central Asian capital cities, you will be waiting for hours. And what I think was a really worrisome trend was the fact that doctors and nurses in Central Asia have been very highly infected. They are really on the front line and they have been affected at a really huge level, which is a sign of this kind of loss of human capital compared to what the Soviet Union regimes was able to do, and the difficulties for the new generation of doctors and nurses to learn about how to manage this kind of crisis. My third point, very briefly, is about social compliance. We are used to compare, you know, the difficulties in having the lockdown respected in Western countries compared to the compliance, of course, of the Chinese population, because they have no choice, but also of South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, even Japan. And so in the case of Central Asia, we have been noticing, and in fact, it works for the whole of Eurasia, for Russia, for Ukraine, for the Caucasus, that it's almost impossible to respect the lockdown when you have an economy that is mostly informal, right? All the Eurasian economy is largely informal and it's largely corrupt, which means that if you combine both conditions, it's almost impossible for a government to have the population respecting the lockdown. You have some exception, of course, the Moscow municipality, because it's Moscow, because it's rich, because it has a lot of tools to coerce the population. In Moscow, the lockdown was quite respected, but when you were in rural Russia, it was not. In Ukraine, it was not. In Central Asia and the Caucasus, it was not. And in a sense, that's understandable because the population is in a very economically fragile condition and they cannot afford to be locked down, right? And I think one of the big lessons of the crisis is that not everybody can telework, right? Only white collars can telework. If you are a blue collar or someone having a very fragile economic position, you have to go to work and you cannot afford, you have to take the risk of being infected. And of course, for the Central Asian society, that was something that they had to face. If now I move to the two big, maybe impacts, which are the one on the global Central Asian economy and the one on geopolitics. So economically, the Central Asian were already in fragile situation, and that has been, of course, increasing. So the crisis has really a large impact on them. We have seen collapse of GDP for all the countries in the region. We have seen the fact that their government debt has been increased, especially the level of their dollarized debt, which is the debt that they finance by export revenues. And because export revenues have been falling, the government is, of course, losing a large part of its state budget. So the fact that the Central Asian states are both rent economies means that they have been impacted a lot because the price of oil, gas, and minerals collapsed. And the fact that Central Asian countries are locked down and totally dependent of trade with China make that, of course, the impact of the crisis is really important for them. And I think that's for them, that's a big kind of awareness now that all the dreams of a very easy transcontinental trade that would be launched by China, they suddenly realize that it will not be so easy to do, right? We have been discussing previously this ultra globalization seems to be kind of challenged now, which means that for Central Asia, if China's way of development is challenged, and if China's dream of a transcontinental trade is challenged, they will be the first to lose, right? Because they were the first that were hoping to benefit for this China Belt and Road strategies. So for them, realizing that they wanted to be in the middle of the global value chain and that maybe that will not work so easily is a kind of big symbolic loss in terms of projecting a better economic development in the future. So that's really one of the big lessons for them, that this ultra globalization led by China may be suddenly challenged, that being in the middle between China and Europe is not necessarily something that will bring a lot of revenues. The second important economic impact is related to labor migration. You know that Central Asian countries are big exporter of labor migrant, about 5 million people. So for Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan, it's just huge amount, between 1/3 and half of their GDP is based on remittances. It's a little bit less for Tajikistan, for Uzbekistan, but it's still millions of people, right, working in Russia. And so the fact that the Russian economy has been stagnating even more, that it's very difficult for migrants to go back home, that really created very stressed economic situation for Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Uzbekistan, especially in rural region where you have the majority of labor migrants are from. So we have seen kind of collapse of prices, really families not being able to, you know, to survive until the end of the month. There are tens of thousands of migrants who got blocked somewhere in Eurasia, between Russia and Central Asia, or between Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. And also symbolically, it's really important because it showed that the Eurasian Economic Union project launched by Russia, when you have a crisis, it doesn't work, right? Russia closed its border with Belarus and with Kazakhstan, even if they were part of the Eurasian Economic Union at the middle of the crisis, and didn't care about them. The same way like European countries closed their border and no one was respecting the Schengen free circulation anymore in the middle of the crisis. So for Belarus, for Kazakhstan, for Kyrgyzstan, it's a big lesson to realize that, well, in case of crisis, Russia will not be here to help. And for Tajikistan and Uzbekistan, who are not part of the Eurasian Economic Union, it's also for them a realization that their dependencies on Russia in terms of labor migration can be a very difficult one, right? Because they are so dependent on whatever is happening on the Russian economy that it's really impacting them a lot. And at the same time, they don't have any other alternatives, right? There is no other solution than to have migrants living to Russia. So you have this kind of, relationship to China that has been kind of challenged, the relationship to Russia that has been a challenge, and the fact that these governments don't have enough finance to really help their population. So Kazakhstan has been offering very small amount to help its unemployed population. The Uzbek government has refused to help the population. So we now know that in Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, you really have millions of people who are in very difficult everyday situation, with, it seems, raising kind of malnutrition cases and so on. So the winter, because there is a second wave now clearly in Central Asia, the winter will be very difficult, and Tajikistan is really on the verge of a big, maybe not famine, but something that will be where really we will have a large part of the population facing malnutrition issues. And my last point in terms of, my pre-last point in terms of geopolitics is that the Central Asian states have been realizing, so they receive help from China. They receive doctors, they received equipment, they receive masks like everybody received from China, right? And it seems from what we know from the public opinion that there is not, that the crisis didn't really reinforce the anti-Chinese feeling. The anti-Chinese feeling were already there, but there is not, I mean, there is some people with this narrative about the virus is a Chinese virus, but still, because China is very good in promoting itself, people also know that China has been sending equipment and doctors, so it's kind of stabilized the public opinion toward China. But Russia has been totally absent. Russia sent very few things to help the Central Asian countries. Russia didn't help training doctors and nurses. So that is a kind of symbolic link that where Russia could have played a kind of soft power role and didn't, because Russia was itself facing the crisis. The European Union sent quite a good amount of money, but as always, the EU is unable to promote itself well. So nobody knows that things are coming from the EU. So at the end, that doesn't kind of increase the visibility of Europe. And as we said previously, the US have been just totally absent, right? So seen from Central Asia, the West is totally absent, Russia has failed, and only China has been there to help, right? Which is once again reinforcing for them their feeling that even if they don't like China, they don't have any other choice. But the big issue for them is that they see this kind of Chinese assertiveness becoming more and more visible, but they also see that there is no one to confront it, right? So they have this kind of dual position, dual kind of concern that if no one is here to confront China, they feel they will be the next kind of victim of Chinese domination and just be kind of protectorate of China with no other room of maneuver. If they see a confrontation rising between China and the US, it's also bad news for them, right? Because they are in such a geopolitical situation that they cannot really take side, right? They cannot be pro-Western when you are neighboring Russia and China, right? So their room of maneuver, whatever the relationship between US and China will be, their situation will be difficult. They don't need a too assertive China, but they also don't want a kind of open confrontation between the West and China because they are in the middle and they will be losing because they cannot take a choice side. The only good kind of geopolitical aspect of the crisis has been regional cooperation. And as you know, the region has been known for lacking regional cooperation for the last 3 decades. So that was a kind of good sign that can be explained because the Uzbek regime, now that Islam, the President Karimov is dead and Shavkat Mirziyoyev is much more active, the Uzbek position has been changing a lot. So there have been good communication between Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan. Oh, sorry, disappeared. I'm back. Yeah, I was saying so the regional cooperation has been increased. There have been exchange of communication between the president in the regions. They each other helped. It's very symbolic, you know, each country sends some doctors, some equipment to the neighbor, but for the region, it's a big success, right? Because it's the first time in 30 years that these presidents are able to kind of at least symbolically cooperate together. And that of course give a lot of hope for all those who are hoping for a more kind of institutionalized Central Asian regional cooperation. So we will see in the future if the relationship, especially between the Uzbek president Mirziyoyev and the new Kazakh president Tokayev, will increase and kind of create a dynamic for regional cooperation. And my last point, and then I will stop, I think that, of course, as everywhere in the world, we have seen a reinforcement of the surveillance structure. So, of course, in kind of so-called well-established democracy, you can hope that there will be some pressure from public opinion, that there will be some discussion between security and privacy, and that there will be a kind of return to normal life with less kind of surveillance mechanism. But for countries that are already authoritarian, like the one in Central Asia, and we noticed the same, in fact, in Russia, so regimes that are either authoritarian or hybrid, the pandemics has been really a good opportunity to suppress dissent, to have new strategies of controlling public opinion, and to strengthen authoritarian norms. And so one of the big trends that we have noticed all over the region, and the same it was in Russia also, is that the government tend to hide the number of infection, and what is even more important, they try to forbid doctors for talking publicly about their condition at work in a hospital. There have been several doctors and nurses who got kind of jailed for talking openly about the situation and the lack of help from state structure. There have been several journalists or citizens who have been jailed for so-called spreading false information about the danger of the pandemics, about also, you know, in Central Asia, funerals are a big event with usually hundreds of people. So there have been a lot of tensions about the fact that the state wanted, of course, to forbid people to attend funerals and arrested and people. And when it was kind of denounced, then journalists got arrested. So you can see a lot of kind of strategies of public control. Kazakhstan also reinforced its video surveillance, of course, as everywhere in Eurasia. And all the so-called power ministry, the police, the security service, and the military has been the one kind of holding the crisis was, of course, by definition, they don't have any knowledge in case of health of pandemics. So that is a kind of worrisome trend for a region that is already quite authoritarian and kind of caught between Russia and China. And you can see a rise of Chinese product of artificial intelligence and, you know, smartization of the cities, selling all this kind of software and videos for controlling the population. That market in Eurasia is now widely open for Chinese product, especially in the name of health and fighting against the pandemics. So it's a quite, I think, quite worrisome perspective for the future of the Central Asian countries. And I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Marlene. So we have the initial statements and interventions from our 4 members of the panel. And I was also informed that some of the panelists will have to leave earlier than 1 p.m. Lisbon time. So probably we will finish the panel a bit earlier. But now it's time to give the word to the audience and to accept your questions directed to our panelists. So please feel free to put your questions or remarks. Any question or comment? I hope you are all hearing me, aren't you? It's not okay. So we don't have any question from the audience. So probably we can make kind of a second round if there is no questions.
If I can take only one word, because the perspective and the framework was wider than was thinking about previously, and in the sense of the links between Central Asian countries and Greater Eurasia. So I see our friend Hussein in link with from Turkey, or always a friend of us. We are in the same friendship through Luís Tomé, and we are. I'm very happy to see you. So maybe that is a suggestion for sure for Hussein, but also for Marlene, because in many ways Turkey is at the focal point of international politics from 2016, and COVID was, as we said and we mentioned, like a tunnel, no? In which there is a channelizing of a lot of factors. So how can we entangle, how can we understand some trends between these big players? Because also in the sense of, so I'm an historian of international relations, so Xinjiang or Turkestan, Eastern Turkestan, was at the middle of a lot of debate in that sense. But in these last months, so the approach was different. No? Also in this dynamics between Islam, Turkish world, and Chinese, and this big world. So suggestion. So that was sorry.
Thank you, Andrea. I also will launch a topic or a question, and then I'll give the word to all participants. This was a topic that was, you know, touched by my colleague Bruno Reis, but probably I would like to hear a little bit more about these. And it's the the way that it's related to the United States and the way that the pandemic is affecting relations between the United States and Europe. The way this crisis is affecting the transatlantic link, and especially in relation to NATO. And what would be the consequences for the future in terms of European defense and security. So this would probably a second topic that I'm addressing Bruno, but panelists and other members of the audience, of course, can touch upon. Is there any other questions? So we have already Andrea's, mine, intervention. There's a question, well, a third question that I will address and then give the word back to the panelists. Is a question from Yasmin Selikol, and it's a methodological question, and asking how safe is it to generalize and talk in terms of Central Asian countries, considering the local dynamics, developments, and particularities. And this is a question addressed directly to Professor Laruelle. So probably I will follow the reverse order of your initial interventions and start with Professor Marlene for another round with our panelists.
Good, thank you. So yeah, to answer that last question, of course, it depends on the level of generalization you want to do. I mean, the same way that, for example, when we discuss the migration policy of Europe, we tend to say you have Western Europe and Central and Eastern Europe, and both have different vision of what should be European migration policy. That's also a generalization, right? You should go country by country. So that's the same for Central Asia. There are still some level of unity if you want to compare them to the big other region around, but otherwise you can go country by country, and each of them has a specific combination of the political regime, relationship to their own public opinion, their economic capacity, their state efficiency. So it's as for the other region in the world, the level of generalization is possible only when we have like 15 minutes to make a brief summary, but otherwise we should go country by country. And on the first comments on the relationship to Turkey, what I can say that, at least for Central Asia, Turkey is, I mean, the perception of Turkey has changed a lot, of course, with Erdogan's transformation these last years, but you have arriving younger generation of Central Asia that feel much closer to Turkey than you had before, right? So before, Central Asian elites were feeling close to Turkey because they were admiring kind of Kemalist tradition of Turkey and considering that was a good model for them. Now you have a younger generation that is more looking at Erdogan's policy as a potential model for Central Asia. So people who want both a regime that would be more democratic than what they have now, but that would also be more openly Muslim or Islamic. And so that you can feel that you have a generational change in Central Asia in the relationship toward Turkey. And I remember during the big 2015 crisis between Turkey and Russia around the Syrian crisis, it was a big issue for Central Asian public opinion. And here also I'm generalizing. It was mostly discussed for Kazakh and the Kyrgyz public opinion because they are the most active public opinion with social media. There was a lot of comments like, we don't want Turkey and Russia to have bad relations. We need them to be friends because otherwise, once again, we will have to make a choice, and we don't want to have to make a choice. And remember that for Central Asia, Turkey is one of the only countries with the post-Soviet space where they can go without visa. So for them, the ability to go to Turkey, travel to Turkey, and kind of keep ties with Turkey is really very important. So I think on the long run, the role of Turkey will grow again in Central Asia, even if it was less visible this last kind of few years. Thank you.
Thank you. Luís Tomé?
Yeah, I'm tell something on transatlantic relations, but I suggest maybe Professor Ushinbashi, he wants to say something on Marlene Laruelle's comments, if you agree, Luís.
Sure. Hello, Professor.
Give the floor.
Thank you, my dear friend. I think the conference is very important. I'm sorry I'm late to join you, but I had some other meetings. But whatever it is, as far as I can see now, until the last analysis from Dr. Laruelle, very interesting analysis when I do look to the perception of the young generation and old generation of the Central Asian Turkish republics towards Turkey. It is true, since 18 years, this generation did not have any other Turkish political leader in power as Tayyip Erdogan. So they grow up differently as their fathers in the 90s when the Soviet Union was dissolved. But the basic question is here. Of course, not all the Turks go to Central Asia without visa, or the Central Asian people can come to Turkey without visa. No, it is not. There are visa requirements for countries. Turkmenistan is maybe one of them, Tajikistan and even Kazakhstan. But the fact remains that Turkey is a crucial country. In recent days and months, Turkish foreign policy now is very much deeply involved in the Middle East, but Tayyip Erdogan discovered now Turkic world. So this is why the Turkish Council, Turkish Kenesh, is now getting more important. Countries like Hungary became now observer countries. And Turkey, after so many years of neglect to Central Asia, has now a different eye to this area. But the question will be how Turkey will continue to exercise certain influence in Central Asian countries. It will be not so easier as before. But one country in Central Asia plays key role. This is Uzbek, the entire atmosphere in Central Asia. The Turkish-Uzbek relations improve very good. I speak also to Central Uzbekistan's economic and diplomatic university. We have increasing of intellectual cooperation, political and economic cooperation. International relations are bad, then the Turkish relations to Central Asia is getting cooler. So there is a relation how Turkey and Russia deal with each other. And Turkey lost millions of dollars because of this Russian-Turkish conflict. And it was actually Nursultan Nazarbayev who improved the relations between Turkey and Russia through his diplomatic and political intervention. But what Laruelle said is interesting, because the European Union now has a new policy towards Central Asia under the title New Partnership, a New Neighborhood policy. And this is going to be realized with the contribution of Turkey. It is much easier to go there as a partner together with Turkey. And I think Turkey is now the country in the area during the epidemic period in particular, contributed a lot of support, and Turkey is partly very successful in fighting the pandemic. despite the fact that recently the numbers increase again. But we see here, even in the case of healthcare, how in the future new institutions probably will be defined for a common health policy, probably. Last but not least, maybe just for now, Turkey is discovering Central Asia again. Many years, in the last 10 years, Turkey neglected this, looked more to Middle East, which I do consider was a wrong policy anyway. But now, the more Tayyip Erdogan is disappointed by the Arabs, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, United Arab Emirates, etc., the more it discovers Central Asia and Caucasia. So it is getting more Turkish nationalistic in this sense. This is a new phenomena which appears now, but how it will go further, we will see. But as dear friend Andrea said, Turkey is definitely one of the regional powers and game changers in certain political fields, I would say, in this area. This is why European Union, China, and Russia, they consider Turkey as a partner with whom you can make economic relations, political relations, and to a certain degree, military relations, about which maybe I will talk tomorrow.
Thank you, Professor Bashi, for sharing your wisdom and your knowledge with us. And given the time constraint, Luís Tomé, since I believe that both Bruno and Andrea have to leave a bit earlier, would you mind if I pass the word to Bruno first, and then to Andrea, and then we'll get back to you in the end. So following the reverse order, Bruno, please.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I'll try to stay until the end, but let's see. Just maybe start with this topic, which has just been discussed, but and linking it with what you asked, Luisa. I actually have a problem, and it's a fascinating question, this kind of level of analysis and also labeling. Of course, all labels are to a certain degree imperfect. You can even question the national label, especially if you have huge countries like China or Russia. As a Chinese colleague once told me, China is an empire disguised as a nation state. So of course that also applies to regional areas. I actually have a problem with Asia, and this is an ongoing discussion with Luís Tomé, for instance. Of course, I have no problem with Asians or with Asian countries. I do have a problem with the label and the way it is used, because it's simply too vast. So we certainly have problems of cohesion, of actedness in Europe. But there is something there. And of course, the obvious thing there is the European Union. It has many problems, but it is a real thing. And for instance, in terms of defense and security, which is my main area, we keep discussing how can European countries spend more together, more in a coordinated way, instead of duplicating efforts. But the problem in Asia is Asian states are not spending money together. They are spending it very often against each other. So China is not spending money with India, it's spending money against India or against Japan. So I think that's a fundamental problem with this idea of a rising Asia. I think, of course, Asia as a region of the world is increasing in importance. Asian states are increasingly important, and of course, China is in a league of its own so far, and maybe India will get there. I think most other Asian states can aspire to be significant middle powers or regional powers, like in the model of Japan, not in the model of China or the United States. But I do have a problem there, and also more deeply, I think it's a problem of. I think it's much more likely to see a more multipolar world where the United States and the West will still play, especially the United States, but even Europe, if it remains more or less cohesive, can play a major role. So I think more in terms of relative decline than collapse, and more of a multipolar world. So I wanted to put that out there. That links with the question that Luís Nuno was asking, in the sense that, of course, the biggest challenge for the West is internal cohesion. So the big collapse of China was because it lost internal cohesion. It lost a very strong state that it used to have for a very long time during the 19th century and the early part of the 20th century. So I think the big challenge here is polarization and fragmentation in the United States, polarization and fragmentation in Europe, within the European Union, and divisions and polarization and tensions between the US and Europe, as you mentioned. I think China does not have the potential to really cause a profound rift between the United States and Europe. You know, Portugal, many other Western countries will usually say we distinguish between economic partners and long-term historic allies. So we distinguish between China and the United States. I think in any event, it's clear it's creating difficulties. You know, you keep hearing very senior figures saying, you know, even before we met with, even before we sit, you know, Pompeo or the Secretary of Defense, Esper, or, you know, whatever the issue is, they will always bring China first. They will always keep bringing China. I think Europeans would prefer, and I think probably most other states in Eurasia would prefer, in the case of Europe, of course, again, it's different from Central Asian states. They have a bit more room for maneuver, but they still feel, certainly a country like Portugal feels, we really cannot, if the choice is between the United States and China, we will have to choose the United States, given our geopolitics and the rest, and defense and all of that. But they would prefer not to be forced to choose, at least in a radical way, to completely decouple. I think the preferred choice would be something like, even in terms of the European interest, yes, we realize that, you know, pajamas and 5G is not the same thing strategically in terms of security, surveillance, sabotage. So yes, we can accept that maybe we cannot have a long-term, medium-term, we cannot have China dominating 5G in Europe. We will have to work with the US on that, but we still want investment, we still want trade in many other areas with China. By the way, we also want to profit from this increasing tension to force China to play fairer, because that's also a major irritant. It's not just the United States who is very irritated with China. Increasingly, very powerful actors in Europe, namely huge, the main companies, the main multinationals in Europe are very irritated with China. They waited for decades that finally the Chinese would really open their market. It never happened. They feel they are being stolen from their copyright and their intellectual property and all that. So this is a major irritant in Europe, not just something brought from because of pressure from the US. So I think this would be the kind of a more selective relationship, a more balanced relationship, certain key areas for security and defense, more kind of more close to China. I think that would be the preferred choice, but this is certainly a cause of tension. And let me just add, there is another important rift within NATO nowadays, which is with Turkey. And of course, the tensions between Turkey, Cyprus, and Greece. I'm sure, you know, the different countries have, as you know, have different, very strong, and different arguments. I think, again, most European countries would prefer a mediated kind of a moderate response, a negotiated response, some kind of agreement between the parties. But this has created tensions also with France, as you know, these incidents in the Mediterranean. So this is also an additional factor which has been creating tensions and rifts in NATO, and it will be interesting to follow up. Thank you.
Thank you, Bruno. And now I'll give the word to Professor Andrea Carteny.
Yes, only
if you want to add some comments.
I already said, but maybe a suggestion for Luis, who is going to be the next and maybe the conclusion, because it was very important as the chessboard of the Greater Eurasia is so the field on the competition US and China. So as Bruno said, just said, so Europe, if there is a role. So if Czech Republic can give a message when goes to Taipei and giving a kind of so to account this government as another factor of balance, and the Indo-Pacific as this other area where play the game of US-China, if can be also defined as a new Cold War or something like that, but in the sense of after COVID international relations based on security and digital challenges.
Thank you, Andrea. Luís, do you want to, if we don't have any more questions from the audience, this will be the concluding remarks.
Yeah, I just to have some comments on two questions. First, on the transatlantic relations. In my view, of course, the pandemic crisis creates more problems, more crises in the transatlantic relations. This is nothing new, but we all remember that it was not possible even for President Trump to organize a G7 summit, even online, because of the strong against reaction from Chancellor Merkel from Germany. We all know the differences between European and US in what comes the World Health Organization, for instance. But in the future, if Trump again be the next president of the United States, we probably will have more problems, not only because of the protectionist view targeting Europe, threatening Europe with sanctions, even during the pandemic crisis, trying to buy vaccines from the German and British pharmaceutical industries. But in the near future, I see no possible that European countries, because of the economic and social problems coming from this pandemic crisis, can fulfill the commitment in 2024 to spend 2% of its GDP on defense. So this is probably another cause for frictions between the US and European countries, between NATO members. And of course, we are in some international questions side by side with Russia and China. And in US, they are in the other side. For instance, Iran nuclear agreement, Paris agreement, and so on. So this crisis accelerate, underline all divergences between Europe and US, but a lot of things depends on what is going on in the next presidential election. In what comes Asian rising and century, my argument is not that Asia is the center of world geopolitics, because the Asian countries are all together, or they are all allies. My argument is quite the opposite. As the 20th century, Europe was the center of the world geopolitics, not because we are the central point of the First World War, Second World War, and the Cold War. We are having with the US most of economic power and strategic power until the Cold War with the Soviet Union. Now, what we are seeing in Asia is that they are having more and more economic power. In a comparison by regions, Asia Pacific has more than 50% of the world GDP share, 50%. On the other hand, China is becoming the bigger economy in the world. We are seeing that Asia Pacific, after North America, is having by far the biggest arms budgets. Of course, there is an arms race in Asia. But the question is that we are seeing power concentration in Asia Pacific, both economic, diplomatic, strategic power. We see many problems in that region that will, well, the world will depend on what is going on in this region in terms of energy, environment, and climate change. See, for instance, that in Europe, we are worried with the, Russian territorial ambitions in Western Ukraine, Eastern Ukraine, and Crimea. But we have a lot of problems in Asia between territorial disputes, sovereignty, disputes between India and Pakistan, India, China, China, Vietnam, China, Southeast Asian countries, and including the Philippines, hotspots like Kashmir, the Taiwan question, Korean Peninsula. We see the proliferation of weapons, nuclear weapons, are existing in Asia Pacific. The new 3 world nuclear powers are coming from this region: India, Pakistan, and North Korea. So for the good reasons and bad reasons, Asia Pacific is, at least in my point of view, for sure, the central region in world geopolitics. And one example shows like this, when the president of the superpower like US is saying that is calling US the pivot of the Pacific, or is now having the double of the soldiers in Asia Pacific command than in European command. In 1987-88, US have the double soldiers in Europe than in Asia Pacific. Now they are in Europe. We are having only half of the American soldiers. They are already in Asia Pacific. So it's not because they are friends, allies, but because they are competing, but also engaging with each other. China is by far the largest trade partner of the regional allies of the US, Japan, South Korea, Australia, and so on. They created last year the largest trade agreement in the world with China. So for good and bad reasons, Asia Pacific is, of course, in my view, the central region in world geopolitics and geoeconomy. Thank you. Thank you.
Luís, can I just get back to very briefly to Miguel, to Luís' comments? Just to clarify, first of all, my point is, we talk about Europe, we talk about Asia, we have to realize we are talking about very different things, not just in terms of dimension. Yes, of course, Asia is the biggest economic area in the world. It's much larger than Europe in terms of geography, population. What was a complete aberration was that such a small region like Europe, with such a relatively small population, had such a huge share of the global GDP. It's still, by the way, by far the most prosperous, richest region and the most interesting market, even for a place like China. The second point that I wanted to make is to do with the fact that I don't see Asia going from 50% to 80% of the world economy. So arguably it's kind of peaked because, hopefully, Africa will also expand significantly, not least in demographic terms, in economic terms. Latin America also has a lot of scope to expand. So I don't see Asia just keep growing until it reaches 100% or 90%. So maybe it has already kind of peaked. But the main point is, I think we should realize it's not an actor. It's a region, and it's a very different region, much more diverse also than Europe. So if you're talking about Central Asia, as we've been for a while, that's very different from China or from Japan or from Southeast Asia so it's a very diversified region. But of course, I understand many of the points of Luís are very, very much valid points. I think, and I also wanted to come back to that last point, I completely agree. I think there is a real risk of a collapse of the West. NATO is more divided probably than ever. There are very, very deep tensions between the current US administration and Europe. And maybe this will signal a break between the traditional kind of bipartisan consensus in Washington between Republicans and Democrats in terms of the priority to NATO and to relations with European allies. So I think there's a real risk there. I don't see, especially the US collapsing, even if it becomes very problematic, as Luís was saying, if you can be significant by being problematic. I agree with that. Even if it becomes very problematic, I don't see the US collapsing into irrelevance. I think it will still play a major role, not least because it's also by oceanic power. It's as much a Pacific power as an Atlantic power. Again, I tend to be skeptic about this idea, maybe because I'm an historian like Andrea, the United States has been saying since the 18th century that it will pivot to China. That was one of the priorities of the United States as an independent nation. You know, the Tea Party, the tea came from China. They wanted to sell and buy directly from China. It still hasn't meant that the Atlantic and the traditional connections, namely economic connections with Europe, have become irrelevant, very, very far from it. 48 US states still export and invest more in Europe than in Asia, and that includes California, which was meant to be. They will change radically, but I think we should be prudent there. But it's, of course, a fascinating debate, and especially to have with someone as well informed and with interesting arguments as Luís.
Let me add just a brief comment, a final sentence. My argument is that we cannot assume right now that this new bipolarity between US and China will be confrontational, only confrontational. We cannot assume right now that we are now for sure in a new or a second Cold War, because there are a lot of elements, a lot of room between the US and China. Even from an historic point of view, there are much more time with a very good relation between China and the US than confrontation moment. So one of the worries in US allies in Asia Pacific is that in terms of power to rule the world, the US will articulate interests with China against the interests of countries just like Japan, Australia, the Philippines, India, and so on. So we don't know the answer, we don't know the future, but I do not put all the cards in a competition game, in a confrontational game between the US and China. There is also the chance of a real articulation of interest between China and US, and that is not a good thing for Europe as well.
Thank you, Luís, Bruno, for your small debate. If I can say, is there any final question or thoughts from the audience? Okay. No questions, no more interventions. So I think that we will finish
yes.
here. Professor Basha, yes.
Actually, tomorrow, definitely we will talk about NATO, but I profited a lot from Luís Tomé's analysis now. I think he is right that the future is unknown. We don't know what will happen, and we should have not to put all the things in the same basket, not all the eggs in the same basket. So we should look probably from a little bit different perspectives, that there will be new institutions emerging, there will be new actors coming in. And I think is also right, NATO and the European Union, like important international institutions, they fail to find certain solutions, as also Mr. Bruno was mentioning rightly. The transatlantic relations suffer greatly now. The American attitude towards Europe is not the same as it was in the early 50s. And probably when Donald Trump is elected again, then probably we will have much more confrontational transatlantic relations in the next 4 years. So I think this is also the area of Luís Tomé's field to think in strategic terms, which I like also very much. When we look from the strategic perspective, I think we will see a new world emerging, new challenges. The main question is, how can we respond to those new emerging challenges? Do we have enough institutions, or are the institutions from today strong enough to face these challenges? Where I have some doubts. I mean, Middle East is changing, Asia is changing. Donald Trump openly declared China as enemy. So it means we, the Turks or the Europeans, we will probably also change our position towards China, not so friendly as before pandemic. I mean, last year until January, China was one of the very much, if you want, countries which had a lot of public diplomacy, very positive image. But today, even in Turkey, when you go on the street and ask the people who is responsible for the pandemic, they don't say that it is America, they say it is China. They created this, they now solve their problems and they grow economically and we suffer. I think the latest publication by Woodward, Reis, in his book, Woodward interviewed Donald Trump. And Donald Trump tried to underestimate the pandemic, not in order to create panic. But I have one probably supporting Tomé in this respect. China is going to have more problems than before pandemic. They suffer under the credibility now in international arena, like the Americans under Donald Trump in the last 4 years. So we have, looking from the Western European point of view, America and China, in our eyes, lost their credibility. And the question is how to balance now these two powers within NATO, within the European Union, and even within the Middle East region. So it will be interesting the coming years, but supporting Tomé, not because only he is my friend, but also intellectually, because it puts this strategic I would say, interpretation in such a good way. And I think we will have more debate, more discussions. How do we react to the changing power status and power relations in this part, Central Asia, as well as in other parts of the world?
Thank you, Professor Bashi, for your intervention. What an excellent way to finish this panel. So I want to thank you all for participating, both the speakers and the audience. Thank you for the questions, for the debate. I believe this was a very fascinating and thought-provoking panel. And before leaving, I just want to remind you that we have two also excellent panels starting at 2:30 p.m. Lisbon time. One on great power politics in search for new world order, and the second one on enduring conflicts in Eurasia. So these two panels at 2:30, and then the program of the conference will continue throughout the afternoon. So again, thank you very much. It was a pleasure being here, and I'll probably see you in the afternoon sessions.
Thank you, Luís. An applause.
Thank you. Take care.
All of you. Thank you.